The meeting hall floated in the darkness between stars where no single species could claim advantage. Daniel Price stood before the gathered aliens and felt the weight of 47 different species watching him, with eyes that ranged from compound lenses to heat sensors to things he could not even name. He had been a diplomat for over 20 years and had learned to read the subtle shifts in alien body language that meant anger or fear or contempt. Right now he was reading all three from nearly every delegation in the vast chamber. The Corthan leader rose from his seat and his massive form cast shadows across the crystalline floor. His voice came through the translation devices, cold and final. Human delegation, we have given you our terms and they are not open for discussion. You will abandon your outer colonies. You will reduce your military fleet to 1/10 of its current size. You will allow us to oversee all your technological development. These are the conditions for your species to continue existing in galactic space. Daniel kept his face neutral, even as his stomach turned. They wanted humanity to give up everything they had built in the past 30 years of space exploration. New Portland, where his sister lived with her family. Cascade Station that connected human space to the wider galaxy. 17 worlds where humans had struggled and died to build new homes. All of it would be handed over to species that had decided humanity was growing too fast and needed to be controlled before they became a threat. And if we refuse your terms, Daniel asked, though he already knew what the answer would be, then the combined military forces of the Galactic Council will enforce these terms by whatever means necessary. The Corthan replied, your species has expanded too quickly and developed technology at a pace we find disturbing. You represent a potential threat to the stability we have maintained for thousands of years. We are offering you the chance to survive, even if it means accepting limitations on your growth. Many council members argued we should simply eliminate you as a threat, but I convinced them to offer you this option instead. Daniel looked around the chamber at species that humanity had hoped to call friends, the Vaxel with their insect-like bodies who had traded art and music with human colonies, the Theron whose philosophers had engaged in lengthy debates with human academics, the Metharians who had seemed genuinely interested in human culture and history. Now they all sat silent and refused to meet his gaze. The message could not have been clearer. Humanity stood alone and the choice was submit or be destroyed. I need time to consult with my government, Daniel said quietly. You have 48 hours, the Corthan leader announced. After that time period expires, we will consider silence to be the same as refusal and we will act accordingly. The holographic projection dissolved and Daniel found himself back on the human embassy vessel orbiting the neutral station. His assistant Linda Morris stood nearby and her face had gone pale. They really mean it, she whispered. They are going to attack us if we do not surrender. Daniel walked to the window and stared out at the distant stars. Send an encrypted message to Earth with the highest priority coding we have. Then start preparing evacuation procedures for all embassy personnel. You think it will be war, Linda said. I think the Galactic Council has made a serious mistake, Daniel replied. They believe we will submit because the numbers favor them so heavily. They do not understand that humanity has a long history of refusing to accept impossible odds. The message reached Earth 8 hours later, traveling through quantum-linked communication systems that made distance irrelevant. President Catherine Walsh stood in the command center buried deep beneath mountains, where it could survive anything short of a planet-killing weapon. Around her were the military, chiefs and intelligence directors and senior advisors who had spent years preparing for the possibility of this exact scenario. What are our options? She asked without preamble. General Patrick Hayes brought up displays showing the tactical situation. We are outnumbered 40-1 in terms of ships and their technology exceeds ours in several key areas. If we fight them using conventional tactics, we will lose. If we accept their terms, we survive, but only as a controlled species under their permanent supervision. There is a third option, said Director Susan Cole from Strategic Intelligence. Her voice stayed quiet, but everyone in the room turned to listen. We have been developing it for 7 years, ever since our analysts predicted this situation might occur. The project designation is Hellfire. The president looked at her with sharp focus. Tell me what it is. Susan took a breath before speaking. It is a strategic doctrine rather than a single weapon. It is based on the fundamental differences between humanity and every species in the Galactic Council. Every one of them evolved as either prey animals or as pack hunters with strong social codes. They fight wars according to rules and traditions and limitations that developed over millions of years. They have concepts of proportional response and protected civilian zones and acceptable casualty rates. And we do not, the president said. We have those concepts, Susan replied, but we are also willing to set them aside when our survival is at stake. Humanity evolved as endurance hunters and pursuit predators. We are persistent and adaptable, and when we are cornered, we will do things that other species find unthinkable. Project Hellfire assumes that if we cannot win a conventional war, we will change what kind of war we are fighting. General Hayes displayed new information. We have assets positioned that the Council does not know about. Automated ships launched a decade ago now waiting in deep space. Production facilities hidden in asteroid fields. Combat doctrines that violate every galactic convention on warfare. The president was silent for a long moment. If we do this, there will be no going back. They will fear us. They already fear us, Susan replied. That is why they are doing this now. The question is whether we make them fear us enough to leave us alone, or whether we allow them to reduce us to a species that can never threaten them. Again, Catherine Walsh looked at each person in the room and saw the gravity of the decision reflected in their faces. Draft our response to the Galactic Council. Tell them we refuse their terms completely. Tell them that any attempt to enforce compliance will be met with total resistance using every tool at our disposal, and activate Project Hellfire. All protocols, Hayes asked. Everything, the president confirmed. If they want to see what humanity does when we have our backs against the wall, we will show them exactly that, and may whatever gods exist have mercy on us all. The response reached the council chambers 18 hours later. The Corthan leader read it before the assembled delegates, and his voice carried disbelief. They refuse. They actually refuse our terms despite being completely outnumbered and outgunned. They threaten total resistance, as if they have any chance of victory. Perhaps they are bluffing, suggested a Vaxil diplomat. Or perhaps they are simply ignorant of military realities, added a Theron representative. They are a young species. They may not fully understand the forces arrayed against them. But Ambassador Krell of the Matharian Commonwealth sat in silence and felt the first stirrings of doubt. He had studied human history extensively as part of his role, and he knew something the others seemed to have forgotten. Humanity had a pattern when faced with overwhelming odds. They did not calculate probabilities and make rational decisions. They fought with everything they had, and they adapted, and they found ways to win that no one anticipated. Their history was full of smaller forces defeating larger ones through sheer determination and creative tactics that broke all conventional rules. I think we may have made an error, Krell said quietly, but no one was listening. The council had already decided that humanity would submit or be destroyed, and they were confident that the decision would be an easy one for the humans to make. They were about to learn that humanity's definition of an easy decision was very different from their own. The Council Armada gathered in the Altair system, 300 light-years from Earth, and it was the largest military fleet ever assembled in recorded galactic history. 12,000 warships from dozens of species formed formations that stretched across millions of kilometers of empty space. Admiral Vexthor commanded from his flagship and felt confident that this display of overwhelming force would end the conflict before it truly began. The humans would see this armada and understand that resistance was pointless. Our intelligence reports indicate the humans have only 300 warships of any significant size, his tactical officer reported. Even if they deploy every vessel they possess, we outnumber them 40-1, and our technology is superior in most categories. Then this will be over quickly, Vexthor replied. We will take their colonies with minimal resistance and transport their populations to resettlement areas. Perhaps losing a few worlds will teach them the wisdom of accepting our guidance. What the Admiral did not know was that 17 light-years away, automated monitoring stations had detected his fleet the moment it assembled. The data traveled through quantum communication systems to hidden facilities across human space, where artificial intelligence programs analyzed every ship and predicted their likely tactics and destinations. Humanity had been preparing for this war for 7 years, and they had no intention of fighting it the way the Council expected. Captain Ryan Foster sat in the command chair of the stealth ship Shadowrunner and reviewed his orders one final time. His vessel was one of 30 such ships positioned around Council space over the past 5 years. They were small craft barely larger than a corvette, but they were coated in materials that bent sensor beams around them, and their reactors produced almost no heat signature. To Council sensors, they were effectively invisible. "We have confirmation that the Council fleet is moving toward New Portland," Ryan said to his crew. "Estimated arrival in 72 hours. We are authorized to engage targets of opportunity." His weapons officer, Julie Grant, checked her displays. "All shadow units are reporting ready status. Targets are locked and verified. Execute the first phase of Hellfire," Ryan ordered quietly. The Shadow Runner and her sister ships moved silently toward their designated targets, but they were not aiming for the mighty warships of the Council fleet. Instead, they approached the supply depots and fuel stations and massive logistics vessels that kept an armada of 12,000 ships operational. Warfare, as humanity had learned through bloody centuries, was not just about who had the bigger guns. It was about who could keep fighting longer. The first indication anyone in the Council fleet had of humanity's response was when Supply Station Alpha 7 simply vanished in a brilliant nuclear explosion. Before shocked officers could react, 2 more stations detonated in the same manner. Then the automated supply freighters began exploding as their fusion cores overloaded from infiltration programs that had been planted in their systems months earlier. Alarms screamed across every Council ship as Admiral Vexthor demanded explanations. "What is happening? Where are these attacks coming from? We have lost 40% of our fuel reserves," his tactical officer reported with disbelief thick in her translated voice. "Communication relays throughout the sector are offline. Multiple supply stations have been destroyed, but we cannot detect any enemy ships or weapons fire. The explosions appear to originate from within our own facilities." "Sabotage," Vexthor realized with growing horror. "Scan everything. Find those human ships." But the Shadow Runner and her sisters were already gone, slipping back into the darkness of space with their next targets already selected. They had not fired a single shot at an enemy warship. They had not needed to because they understood something the Council had forgotten. A fleet without fuel and supplies was just expensive metal floating in space waiting to die. While the Council scrambled to protect their remaining logistics infrastructure, the second phase of Hellfire activated across 47 star systems. Tiny automated drones no larger than a human fist had been launched years earlier and had drifted dormant in asteroid fields and debris clouds waiting for their activation signal. Now they came to life with a simple mission programmed into their basic computers: find Council military communication satellites and destroy them. Within 6 hours, the carefully constructed network that allowed the Council to coordinate their vast territories began collapsing. Admirals lost contact with their home governments. Supply convoys could not receive routing instructions. Intelligence services went dark as their observation platforms were systematically eliminated by weapons too small to be easily detected or intercepted. In the Council Chamber's emergency sessions tried to make sense of what was happening. "This is beyond anything we anticipated," a Vaxil representative said with her mandibles clicking in agitation. "The humans are not fighting our military directly. They are dismantling the infrastructure that allows our civilization to function. How did they penetrate our security so thoroughly?" "Because we underestimated them," Ambassador Krell replied grimly. "We saw them as newcomers, too young and inexperienced to be a serious threat. We never imagined they would prepare for this conflict years in advance, and we never considered that they would fight in ways we consider dishonorable." The Corthan Chancellor slammed his limb against the Council table. "This changes nothing of substance. We still possess overwhelming military superiority. Order the fleet to advance immediately and crush their colonies. We will force their surrender through the application of raw power." But Admiral Vexthor, receiving the orders through one of the few remaining communication channels, understood that the situation had become far more complicated. Without proper logistics and communication infrastructure, coordinating 12,000 ships across multiple star systems was nearly impossible. He would have to divide his forces and send smaller battle groups to attack different human colonies simultaneously, hoping to force a quick resolution before his supply problems became critical. It was exactly what humanity had been counting on. The strategists who designed Project Hellfire had studied Council tactics extensively, and they knew that, faced with logistical problems and communication difficulties, the Council would respond with the military doctrine they had used successfully for centuries: divide forces to cover multiple objectives, apply overwhelming power to each target, accept higher casualties in exchange for faster resolution. It was a doctrine that worked perfectly against opponents who fought conventionally. Humanity had no intention of fighting conventionally. On Earth in the strategic, Command Center Director Susan Cole watched tactical displays that showed the Council fleet fragmenting into 7 separate battle groups, each heading toward a different human colony. They are dividing their forces exactly as we predicted, she reported to President Walsh. Each battle group still outnumbers our local defense forces by significant margins, but the situation is no longer hopeless. And our colonists? The President asked quietly. Evacuations are 70% complete, General Hayes answered. The people who remain are volunteers who understand what is coming. Defense forces and support personnel who chose to stay and fight for their homes. Catherine Walsh felt the terrible weight of command settle on her shoulders. She was asking thousands of people to stand and fight in battles where defeat seemed almost certain, and all to buy time for the larger strategy to work. Send authorization to all colonies. They may implement local defense protocols. Tell them that Earth stands with them and that their sacrifice will not be forgotten. On New Portland, Commander Greg Sanders stood on the bridge of his defense ship and looked at the tactical readout showing 1,000 Council warships approaching his system. His entire fleet consisted of 23 vessels, and none of them were larger than a destroyer. By every conventional measure, this was not a battle. It was an execution. All ships listen carefully, Greg transmitted to his small fleet. In 48 hours, the Council arrives with overwhelming force. We are not here to win in any traditional sense. We are here to make them pay for every kilometer of space they take. We are here to show them that humanity does not break easily, even when the odds are impossible. Arm all weapons and prepare defensive protocols. If we are going to lose, then we will lose in a way that makes them remember us. Across New Portland and the other targeted colonies, people made their final choices. Some boarded the last evacuation ships heading toward the safety of the inner worlds. Others chose to stay taking positions in defense installations or joining militia units formed from civilians who refused to abandon their homes. They were teachers and farmers and engineers and shop owners who became soldiers because everything they had built was being threatened by forces that saw them as problems to be eliminated. The galaxy was about to learn a lesson that human history had demonstrated countless times throughout the centuries. There is no enemy more dangerous than one who is fighting for survival on their own ground. The Council had the numbers and the technology and the experience of 1,000 successful campaigns. But humanity had desperation and creativity and a willingness to break every rule that civilized species held sacred. The war was just beginning, and neither side yet understood just how. The Battle of New Portland would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Commander Greg Sanders watched his tactical display as 1,000 Council warships emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of his star system. His 23 ships looked like insects facing a tidal wave, and every calculation said this battle would be over in minutes. All ships hold your positions, Greg ordered, keeping his voice steady even though his heart hammered in his chest. Wait until they reach engagement range. On the Corthan flagship, Admiral Thorne looked at the human defensive formation with something approaching disappointment. Is this their entire defense fleet? 23 ships to protect a colony of 5 million people? Their foolishness exceeds all reasonable bounds. Perhaps they plan to surrender once they see our full strength. His tactical officer suggested open a communication channel and offer them one final opportunity, Thorne ordered. The transmission reached Greg's ship moments later. Human vessels, you are facing impossible odds. Power down your weapons and withdraw from this system. We will occupy the colony and relocate your population peacefully. There is no need for bloodshed today. Greg looked at his crew and saw young men and women who had volunteered, knowing this might be a suicide mission. He thought of his wife and daughter who had evacuated 3 days earlier on one of the last transport ships. Then he opened a return channel. Admiral Thorne, this is Commander Sanders, and I have a counter-proposal for you. Turn your fleet around and leave the system immediately, because if you continue your approach, we will show you exactly why threatening humanity was the worst mistake your species ever made. Thorne's laugh echoed through the translation system. Brave words from a commander whose fleet will be destroyed in the next few minutes. All vessels open fire and eliminate these ships. The Council battle group unleashed a devastating barrage of plasma and kinetic weapons that lit up space like a small sun. Greg's fleet scattered with their ships weaving through the incoming fire with desperate speed. 3 destroyers exploded in the first 30 seconds as concentrated fire overwhelmed their shields and turned them into expanding clouds of debris. "Execute Hellfire Protocol 7, Greg commanded. What happened next would change galactic warfare forever. The remaining human ships did not retreat or charge forward in a suicidal attack. Instead, each vessel ejected its cargo holds, which had been packed full of a very specific payload. Thousands of small objects tumbled into space directly in the path of the advancing Council fleet. They looked like debris or wreckage from the destroyed ships, and the Corthan sensors barely registered them as the massive warships continued their advance. Then the objects activated. Each one was a simple drone equipped with a small fusion warhead and a basic artificial intelligence with one directive programmed into its core: find a target and detonate against it. They were not sophisticated weapons, and individually they could not destroy capital ships, but that was not their purpose. The drones swarmed through the Council formation like angry insects, targeting sensor arrays and communication dishes and weapon ports and engine clusters. Corthan point defense systems frantically tried to shoot them down, but there were too many moving too erratically through space. Small nuclear explosions rippled across the fleet as hundreds of drones found their targets. Ships went blind as their sensors were destroyed. Weapons fell silent as targeting systems were blown away. Engines sputtered as control systems were damaged. "We are taking damage across all sectors," Thorne's tactical officer reported with shock obvious in her voice. "Formation integrity is collapsing. Ships are colliding because they cannot coordinate without functional sensors." "How many of these weapons do they have?" Thorne demanded. The answer came as another wave of cargo containers tumbled through the chaos, releasing thousands more drones. Greg's fleet had been converted into nothing but delivery systems for these weapons. Every available space had been packed with drones until the ships were flying bombs that sacrificed everything for one purpose: to hurt the enemy badly enough that they would remember this battle. "All ships proceed to the planet," Greg ordered as his fleet dove toward New Portland's atmosphere, using the world itself as cover. The Corthan fleet, battered and confused but still numbering over 900 ships, reformed and pursued. That was when the planet showed what humans could do when they had time to prepare. New Portland's surface had been transformed in the 48 hours before the Council arrived. Every mining laser and industrial fabricator and construction tool had been repurposed into weapons. The colony had turned itself into a massive fortress using nothing but civilian equipment modified for war. As Council ships entered high orbit, they encountered a defense grid that should not have been possible. Railguns designed for launching or into space now fired solid. Metal slugs at speeds that made them devastating weapons. Chemical factories that once produced fertilizer now manufactured explosives that were launched on converted cargo rockets. Communication satellites had been fitted with microwave emitters that could blind sensors or burn through hull plating at close range. Even the weather control systems had been modified to create electromagnetic interference that disrupted targeting computers. The Corthan fleet found itself in a nightmare. They had overwhelming firepower, but every shot they fired was answered by dozens of improvised weapons from below. Admiral Thorne watched his carefully organized armada descend into chaos as humans threw everything they had into the battle. They were not fighting like any military force he had encountered. They were fighting like cornered animals, using anything and everything as weapons without regard for conventions or honor or proportional response. "Pull back to high orbit and reform the fleet," Thorne ordered. "Prepare for orbital bombardment of the surface installations." But Greg Sanders had one more surprise prepared. Hidden facilities across New Portland launched kinetic kill vehicles that were nothing more than solid chunks of dense metal accelerated to enormous speeds by electromagnetic rails. They were not missiles or guided weapons. They were just mass moving fast enough to punch through any shield through pure physics. 3 of them struck Corthan capital ships, and the results were catastrophic. Hulls designed to withstand energy weapons could not disperse the simple kinetic energy of metal, moving at relativistic speeds. The ships crumpled like paper and broke apart, spilling atmosphere and crew into the vacuum. Thorne stared at his tactical display in disbelief. He had started this engagement with 1,000 ships against 23. He should have won in minutes with minimal casualties. Instead, he had lost over 100 vessels, and hundreds more were damaged. The humans had used tactics that violated every rule of civilized warfare. They had weaponized civilian infrastructure. They had used suicide tactics. They had turned simple physics into devastating weapons. "Withdraw to the system's edge," Thorne ordered. "We need to regroup and reconsider our approach." As the Council fleet retreated, Greg Sanders stood on his bridge and looked at the 6 ships that remained from his original 23. They had lost over 70% of their fleet, but the Council had suffered far worse. More importantly, they had bought time. Time for evacuations to complete. Time for other colonies to prepare their defenses. Time for humanity to show the galaxy that they would not go quietly into subjugation. Across human space, similar battles unfolded at 6 other colony worlds. Humanity could not win through superior firepower, so they won through unconventional tactics and improvised weapons, and a willingness to use every resource no matter how unorthodox. Each colony became a trap where Council forces expecting easy victories instead found themselves bleeding ships and morale. In the Strategic Command bunker, President Walsh watched reports flowing in from all 7 battlefronts. "Casualties?" she asked quietly. "Heavy on both sides," General Hayes reported. "But Council losses far exceed their projections. They expected to overwhelm us quickly with minimal cost. Instead, they are bogged down at every colony, taking damage from weapons they never anticipated." "How long can our colonies hold?" "Days at most, perhaps a week," Hayes admitted. "But that was always the plan. Every hour they spend fighting at the colonies is an hour they are not advancing toward Earth, and every ship they lose makes the rest of the galaxy take notice." Susan, Cole displayed communication intercepts from neutral species. "Multiple governments are watching these battles. The Council promised this would be a quick police action against an inferior opponent. Instead, they are seeing a bloodbath. The political impact is already significant." Catherine Walsh nodded slowly. "Then we need to ensure the galaxy sees everything. Release all tactical footage. Let every species watch how we fight and how the Council responds. Make this as public as possible." Within hours, footage of the battles spread across galactic communication networks. Species throughout known space watched human ships sacrifice themselves to deliver weapons. They watched colonists turn farming equipment into instruments of war. They watched the Council's mighty armada grinding against humanity's desperate resistance. And a question began to spread through diplomatic channels and public forums. If humans fought this hard for remote colonies, what would they do if Earth? 3 weeks into the war, the Galactic Council held an emergency session, and the atmosphere in the crystalline chambers was thick with anger and fear and confusion. The Corthan Chancellor stood before the assembled representatives, and his voice carried a weight that had not been there at the start of this conflict. "We have lost 4,000 ships," he announced, and the number seemed to echo in the sudden silence. 4,000 vessels destroyed or damaged beyond repair while fighting a species we outnumber by a ratio of 40 to 1. The humans continue to hold 3 of their 7 colonies. Our casualties exceed all projections by factors we did not think possible." Ambassador Krell rose, and his scales reflected the chamber's dim light. "This war was supposed to demonstrate our strength and the foolishness of resisting Council authority. Instead, we appear brutal and ineffective to the entire galaxy. 17 non-aligned species have filed formal protests against our actions. 5 are threatening to sever diplomatic relations completely. We are losing the political war even as we grind forward in the military one. Politics mean nothing when measured against military power," Admiral Vexthor argued, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The Admiral had learned painful lessons in recent weeks. Every victory came at cost that made the word victory seem hollow. The humans used tactics that no civilized species would consider. Ships that rammed into larger vessels, automated weapons hidden in debris fields, biological agents that targeted life support systems, mines disguised as wreckage that waited patiently for ships to pass nearby. "Politics mean everything," Senator Lynn Parker said quietly, and every head turned toward the human representative who somehow still sat in these chambers under diplomatic immunity. She stood calmly despite being the only human in a room filled with species actively trying to destroy her civilization. "You wanted to show the galaxy that humanity needed to be controlled. Instead, you have shown them that it takes the combined might of 47 species to fight us to a standstill. You have made us look dangerous and competent and unwilling to submit. Every species watching is now calculating what it would cost them to fight humanity alone." The Vaxil representative clicked her mandibles in frustration. "You speak as if you are winning this war. Your colonies are falling. Your ships are being destroyed. Earth itself stands exposed and vulnerable. Lin smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then why have you not attacked Earth? Your fleets have had 3 weeks to advance. Earth's location is not secret, yet you remain committed to fighting through our colonies instead of striking at our homeworld. Why is that? The silence that followed was answer enough. The Council feared what humanity might do if Earth itself came under direct threat. The colonists had fought with desperate ferocity that shocked species used to limited warfare. What would billions of humans do if their homeworld faced invasion? What weapons would they deploy? What lines would they cross? The Council had seen enough in 3 weeks to make them very afraid of finding out. What the Council did not know was that their fear was completely justified and that humanity's final response was already in motion on Mars in a facility. Hidden deep underground, Dr. Alan Foster supervised the final preparations of what would later be called humanity's most terrifying achievement. He stood before a massive hangar where 12 ships waited, and each one carried markings in 17 different languages, including every Council tongue. The warnings were simple and direct: biohazard, radioactive, extreme danger. Do not approach, we are really going to do this, his colleague Dr. Claire Hughes said quietly. We are going to make ourselves into the monsters they fear. They made that choice when they gave us an ultimatum, Alan replied. Every species in the Council fights according to rules that developed over millions of years of evolution. They have concepts of acceptable warfare and protected targets and proportional response. We are about to show them what happens when one side does not follow those rules. The 12 ships were designated as Hazard-class strategic deterrence vessels, but everyone called them by their unofficial name, plague ships. Each one carried weapons that had been banned by every civilized species in the galaxy. Biological agents engineered to target specific alien physiology, radiological dispersal devices that would contaminate entire worlds, self-replicating nanomachines programmed to dismantle industrial infrastructure at the molecular level, chemical weapons that made conventional explosives look merciful by comparison. Humanity had signed no treaties limiting these weapons. They had never agreed to Council rules of warfare. And now, backed into a corner with their survival at stake, they were about to deploy the ultimate deterrent. Launch authorization is confirmed, Alan said, checking his console. Once these vessels reach their destinations, the weapons will remain on standby. If Earth falls or if our government is destroyed, the ships will activate automatically, mutually assured destruction on a galactic scale. The ships launched quietly, slipping away from Mars on trajectories that would take them months to reach their destinations. But their existence was immediately broadcast across every Council communication channel. Humanity made no attempt to hide what they had done. They wanted the Council to know. They wanted every species to understand that humanity had positioned weapons of planetary annihilation over 12 Council homeworlds. The reaction in the Council chambers was immediate and explosive. Representatives shouted over each other in dozens of languages, creating a cacophony that the translation system struggled to process. The Theron representative finally made himself heard above the chaos. This is insanity, he shouted. You have positioned weapons capable of killing billions over our homeworlds. If you deploy these weapons, you will commit genocide on a scale the galaxy has not seen in recorded history. That is correct, Lynn Parker replied with a calmness that was more terrifying than any threat. We have positioned weapons that can devastate entire civilizations. The question you need to ask yourselves is whether we are bluffing. Are we truly capable of murdering billions of innocent civilians to ensure our own survival? The Corthan Chancellor's voice shook with rage. You would commit such an atrocity? You would destroy worlds full of civilians who have done nothing to you. Would we? Lynn met his compound eyes without flinching. That is the question that should keep you awake at night. Because honestly, we do not know the answer ourselves. Humanity has never been pushed to the absolute edge of extinction before. We have never had to choose between our complete annihilation and the destruction of other civilizations. I cannot tell you with certainty what my government will do if Earth falls, but I can tell you this with absolute confidence. We are not bluffing about the weapons. Those ships are real. Those payloads are armed, and the decision to deploy them has been delegated to automated systems that will activate if Earth's government is destroyed or if communication is lost for more than 72 hours. The chamber descended into chaos again. Some species demanded immediate military action to destroy the plague ships before they could deploy their weapons. Others argued that any attack might trigger the very catastrophe they were trying to prevent. A few voices quietly suggested that perhaps the entire war had been a terrible mistake, that needed to be reconsidered. Ambassador Krell finally spoke, and his voice cut through the noise. We have entered territory that no council conflict has reached in 3,000 years. The humans are threatening mutual annihilation. They are willing to destroy our worlds if their own world falls. This is a concept we thought we had evolved beyond as civilized species. You evolved beyond it because you achieved positions of safety, Lin replied. You built your galactic civilization on rules that prevent total warfare. But those rules only function when all parties agree to them. Humanity never agreed. We never signed your treaties or accepted your limitations. You tried to force us into submission, and we responded with the only leverage we possess. If we fall, we will drag you down with us. She activated a display showing casualty figures. In 3 weeks, you have killed 30 million humans. Colonists and military personnel and civilians caught in your attacks. We have killed approximately 200,000 of your people, and almost all of them were military targets. Yet we are the ones being called monsters. Why? Because we fight with weapons you find distasteful? Because we refuse to die according to your preferred schedule? You fight without honor, Vexthor said. We fight to survive, Lin countered. And if that requires abandoning concepts of honor, then we will do so without hesitation. You wanted to see what humanity does when cornered. This is your answer. We become exactly what you feared we might become. The question now is what you intend to do about it. On Earth, President, Walsh met with her advisors and reviewed intelligence reports on Council reactions to the plague. Ships. They are fracturing, Susan Cole reported. Several species are reaching out through unofficial channels asking about terms for a negotiated settlement. They are unwilling to risk their homeworlds to continue this war. And the hardliners, the president asked, still pushing for total victory, but their coalition is weakening. Every day this war continues costs them more in ships and lives and political capital. Some council species are facing significant due. The ceasefire took effect 42 days after the war began, and the silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the fighting had been. Humanity had lost 4 colonies and millions of lives and nearly 60% of their military fleet. The Galactic Council had suffered casualties they had not experienced in 3 centuries and faced political chaos that threatened to tear their alliance apart from within. A neutral station was chosen for the peace negotiations, and this time the atmosphere was completely different from the meeting that had started this conflict. Ambassador Daniel Price returned as humanity's representative, but he was not the same man who had stood in the council chambers 7 weeks earlier. That diplomat had believed in reason and compromise and the possibility of finding common ground. The man who returned had watched worlds burn and had authorized weapons capable of killing billions. He carried that weight in his eyes and his voice and his every movement. The council sent a new delegation as well. The Corthan Chancellor had been forced to resign after massive protests on his homeworld. Several of the more aggressive species had withdrawn from the council entirely, rather than continue a war that had become deeply unpopular with their civilian populations. The beings who sat across from Daniel now were chosen specifically because they represented voices that had argued for restraint from the beginning. Ambassador Krell spoke first, and his voice carried a weariness that came from watching everything he had worked to build nearly collapse. Ambassador Price, I want to begin by acknowledging that the Council made serious errors in judgment. We underestimated humanity's determination, and we responded to our fears with aggression. Many of us now recognize that our initial demands were unreasonable and our methods were wrong. Daniel kept his expression neutral. You say this now after millions are dead. Where was this wisdom before you threatened to destroy our civilization? We were afraid, Krell admitted simply. Your species advanced faster than any we had encountered. You developed technologies in decades that took other species millennia. You settled worlds at a pace we found alarming. We saw a potential threat and we decided to neutralize it before it could fully develop. We were wrong. You were also arrogant, Daniel replied. You assumed that because you had more ships, victory was guaranteed. You forgot that desperation creates dangerous enemies. You learned that lesson in Blood and Fire. A Vaxil diplomat named Shira clicked her mandibles softly. We did learn, and the question now is whether we can find a path forward that does not end in mutual destruction. Your plague ships still orbit our homeworlds. That situation cannot continue indefinitely. Then give us a reason to recall them, Daniel said. Offer terms that guarantee humanity's security and autonomy, without demanding we submit to your authority. The negotiations took 3 weeks, and every day felt like walking across broken glass. The Council wanted the plague ships removed immediately. Humanity wanted formal recognition of their sovereignty and the right to maintain whatever military they deemed necessary. The Council wanted some form of oversight on human technological development. Humanity wanted that oversight to be mutual and reciprocal or nothing at all. Slowly and painfully, a framework began to emerge. The Treaty of Terra, as it would be called, was unlike anything in Council history because for the first time they were negotiating with a species they could not dominate. Through force or intimidation, the final terms were simple, but their implications would reshape galactic politics for generations. Humanity's sovereignty over their worlds would be recognized without conditions or limitations. No Council species could demand territorial concessions or military reductions without humanity's explicit consent. A mutual defense and technology sharing agreement would be established, but participation would be voluntary for all parties. Humanity could develop any technology they wished and would share innovations in exchange for access to Council knowledge, but neither side could compel the other. A joint commission would be created to prevent future conflicts, and human representatives would have equal voting power to Council delegations despite representing only one species. The plague ships would be decommissioned under mutual observation, with both sides agreeing to ban weapons of planetary destruction. However, humanity retained the right to maintain strategic deterrence capabilities as insurance against future threats. Finally, both sides would pay reparations. The Council would fund reconstruction of destroyed human colonies. Humanity would compensate families of Council military personnel who had died in the fighting. President Walsh reviewed the treaty in her office deep beneath the mountains and felt an odd emptiness. "We survived," she said to the advisors gathered around her. "But I keep asking myself what we became in the process." General Hayes understood what she meant. "We used weapons we had condemned others for developing. We threatened billions of civilians to secure our safety. We crossed moral lines that we had always said separated us from our enemies. But we are still here," Susan Cole pointed out. "We are still free to make our own choices and control our own destiny. And we established a precedent that the Council cannot simply bully younger species into submission anymore. Others will look at what we did and know there is an option besides surrender. They will also see the price we paid," Catherine replied quietly. "Is that the lesson we want to teach? That survival requires becoming monsters?" Daniel Price spoke from the communication screen connecting him to Earth. "Maybe the real lesson is more complex. We proved we could become monsters if necessary, but we also proved we could choose not to when given the option. We deployed the plague ships, but we did not use them. We fought with brutal tactics, but we still accepted a negotiated peace when it was offered. We showed we could match their ruthlessness, and then we showed we preferred not to." The treaty was signed in a ceremony broadcast across every communication network in known space. Daniel and Krell placed their signatures on the document surrounded by representatives of dozens of species. It should have been a moment of celebration, but the mood was somber, because everyone present understood they were not celebrating victory. They were acknowledging that both sides had stepped back from an abyss that would have consumed them all. Across human space, the reactions were mixed and complex. Some people celebrated the recognition of human sovereignty and the end of fighting. Others mourned the millions who had died and questioned whether independence had been worth such a terrible cost. Veterans of the colonial battles struggled to reconcile the things they had done during the war with their peacetime values and beliefs. In Council territories, similar debates raged with equal intensity. Some species viewed the treaty as shameful capitulation to terrorism. Others saw it as necessary recognition that the galaxy was changing, and that younger species could not be controlled the way they once were. Several governments fell as citizens demanded answers about how the war had been allowed to happen in the first place. 6 months after the treaty was signed, humanity erected a monument on New Portland, where Commander Greg Sanders had made his stand. The colony had been rebuilt, though its population would take generations to fully recover. The memorial was simple stone carved with words in English and 30 Council languages, so that no one could claim ignorance of what had happened here. The inscription read simply, "Here fell those who refused to submit. May their sacrifice remind the galaxy that peace built on subjugation is no peace at all. Let those who come after remember both the cost of freedom and the price of forcing others to fight for it." Daniel stood at the dedication ceremony looking at the crowd of humans and aliens who had gathered. He thought about how close they had come to complete annihilation, and how easily humanity's story could have ended. He thought about the plague ships now dismantled but forever part of their history. He thought about the moral lines that had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. In his speech, he said words that would be quoted and debated for generations across the galaxy. We did not want this war. We did not seek to prove ourselves through violence, but when forced to choose between submission and survival, we chose survival with such ferocity that the galaxy took notice. Some call us monsters for the weapons we built and the tactics we used. Perhaps they are right, but we are monsters who remain free and independent and masters of our own fate. He paused and looked at the faces in the crowd. But we must never forget the true cost. The millions who died, the innocence we lost, the lines we crossed. We remember these things not with pride, but with sober recognition that survival sometimes requires terrible choices, and we must work every day to build a galaxy where such choices are never necessary again. The ceremony ended, and people dispersed, returning to lives in a galaxy forever changed by 7 weeks of war. The Council had learned that force alone could not maintain order. Humanity had learned that freedom came with responsibilities and costs they had never imagined. The treaty signed in desperation and sealed in blood became the foundation for a new understanding among the stars. It was not built on trust or friendship, but on mutual respect born from mutual fear. The galaxy had demanded humanity submit or prove why they deserved to remain free. Humanity's reply had terrified them, but it had also finally made them listen.